Ghosts. Jack felt a strange sensation on the inside of his leg, a not unpleasant tickling. The feeling came and went in regular spasms that he felt through the multiple layers of winter clothing, this being one of the wettest winters in living memory. There had been no snow this year, just months of seemingly non-stop ice-cold drizzle. Mancunians often prayed for snow to break up the monotonous drizzle. Other communities would pray for its absence, as to them it meant major disruption or even death. Be careful what you wish for. It took only seconds for Jack to realize that it was the gentle vibration of his phone that was causing the sensation. He turned off the busy main road into the churchyard and began to frantically remove layers to reach the supercomputer he kept near his loins. He removed it just as it stopped baying for his attention. However, a beat later, a message alert sounded. The preview read, "Forgot your lunch, X." He had been with Hannah long enough to know that this was actually meant as, "How could you forget your lunch again, you idiot? What a waste!" Jack smiled as his brain automatically translated the message. He also knew that the kiss meant, "I'm only worried about you wasting your money and your seemingly deteriorating memory." Droplets of rain formed quickly on the bright screen, so he placed it back into his pocket and continued to walk, firmly zipping up his raincoat against the cold, never-ending rain. The church and its yard were very old, built in the late 1820s, judging by the oldest of the headstones, most of which were so thoroughly weather-worn so that the names were all but illegible. Jack had found himself drawn here often on days off, and strangely, he thought, not entirely consciously. It was only when others, including his own girlfriend, had pointed out its irregularity that he began to philosophize about it. In the same way one is drawn to a local park or beauty spot, he found peace sat on the bench overlooking the hundreds of stone monuments to death. Although the thought of his burial, or worse, exhumation, made his skin crawl, there was a strange serenity to be found here. He had joked once that maybe it's because in a graveyard you can take comfort that there is always someone worse than yourself. In this, Jack was correct. At first, he thought it a trick of the light. Perhaps headlights of a speeding car, or a bus on the distant high street hitting one of the beads of rainwater on his glasses, refracting light into his eyes. As he looked to his left, however, he saw it more clearly. An off-white shape nestled between two large headstones down the left flank of the church. It could have been a dog, he thought, as it had the appearance of damp fur left out too long in the rain. If so, then why didn't it move? Perhaps it was injured. Jack had come to a standstill now on the path that led to the main doors of the church. He removed his glasses irritably, as they had become almost opaque with cold raindrops. He could see much clearer. His feet were on the grass now, his focus on the damp shape between the stones. As he drew closer, he could see it was a person, a young woman in a very old-fashioned white dress and a bonnet made from wool and white cotton trim which sagged pitifully in the rain. She sat with her hands folded and her head slightly drooped, as if in prayer, he thought. He stopped about 10 feet away, the sound of the faraway traffic barely audible over the patter of the rain on the grass and the flow of the water from the church's guttering. He braced himself to speak. "Hello," he croaked, not loud enough. He moved a few feet closer. God, she must have been freezing, he thought, only wearing thin layers of cotton and sat on cold stone. After all, he was cold, even under his 3 layers of winter clothes. He spoke again. "Hello," he said, with forced confidence. He had no idea what to expect in response. Suddenly, she raised her head and turned towards him. Jack now saw clearly that she was a slight woman of about 25 to 30 in full Victorian dress. However, Even more unusual than that was her manner and physical appearance. Far from being pale and rain-swept, she looked surprisingly healthy. Her face was full of colour, and she seemed as comfortable sat on cold stone in the rain as she might have been sat on the warm pew in the shelter of the church. "Oh, hello," she replied in a manner more curious than polite, as if she were the one surprised to see him. Jack searched his mind for the next logical question. "Are you okay? It's really horrible today," he inquired. "Hardly," she replied coldly. "I was wondering when I would get another one. He really made me wait this time. Not that it will make a difference." Jack made no attempt to hide his bemusement, and, beginning to regret his decision to help, he took half a step back. She noticed, and he froze. He was involved now. Too late to leave. "Sorry, am I keeping you?" she asked in a monotone Mancunian accent. Definitely Manc, but somewhat different, he thought. And her eyes, they seemed to bore into him with an intensity Jack had never seen before in his short life. "Yes, no. Well, I'm a bit late for work, but that's okay. You are more important. Are you sure you're not cold? How long have you been sitting here for? Do you work for the church?" He gestured to her bonnet, then cringed at his own assessment. He braced for an angry response. She continued to maintain eye contact with him. Those tortured eyes. "No, these are not my church clothes. In fact, they're not really clothes at all." Jack relaxed slightly. "Oh, I see. Are you an actor? Are they putting on a play in there or something?" There was a second raised grave marker nearby that lay flat and about a foot off the ground. Jack began to sidestep slowly towards it. He sat down on the cold, wet stone opposite her in what he saw as an act of solidarity. Although she maintained eye contact, she was neither smiling or frowning at him. She stared at him with a look that said he might do something useful at some point, so she better pay attention. "Actor," she replied, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yeah, like Amdram? Theatre club?" "Oh, a thesp?" No, not me. No time for that." "Listen, do you want my coat? I've got another one underneath." Jack began to unzip his coat. "No, I'm fine." "Do you live around here? Do you want me to call someone?" "No." She continued to stare at him. "Do you want me to sit with you for a little bit?" He looked up. The grey clouds were higher in the sky and the rain had eased off almost completely. "What about your job?" she asked. "Won't there be hell to pay?" Jack sensed a hint of sarcasm. He found he was getting a little impatient and this bothered him. "Ha, no," said Jack with a smirk. This was the first bit of levity she had shown. Perhaps there was a sense of humour. He searched for something to say to elevate the mood. "I'll just say I got hit by a car on the way in." She stared at him quizzically. Jack swallowed heavily, somewhat disappointed that his attempt at humour had failed. "Car? One of those?" She gestured at the road and its distant, thundering traffic. "Yeah," Jack replied, his eyebrow raised unintentionally. He lowered it so as not to cause offence. This woman needs help, he thought, and he wasn't the one. Plus, he was late for work, and what would Hannah say when he told her he had sat in the graveyard all morning talking to some woman, a younger woman? He stood up, intending to say his goodbyes. "Okay, so I best get going now." "You're okay, aren't you? You're just gonna sit there for a bit longer, then walk home?" There was an uncomfortable silence, and he began to turn away. "I can't walk." He turned back sharply. "What? Why not? What did you do?" "I've been asking myself that for a very long time." Over a century. Or at least, I think so. I gave up keeping count a very long time ago. I also gave up trying to help you poor lost souls a long time ago too. Part of his cruelty is to give you hope of redemption. Giving you the lock but not the key. You get the picture. Jack had sat back down to face her once more. I'm not lost, said Jack. He stared at her now with great intensity, eyebrows slightly raised and mouth agape. You are. You live in. And you're not. Jack shot back with some frustration. Her cryptic answers were really beginning to annoy him. That's why you can't walk. Can't feel the cold. It's a bit too early in the morning for this. I'm just trying to help you, and you know what? I shouldn't have bothered. Keep talking. She cut him off. Jack was stunned silent again, staring. Get it out of your system, she continued. I've got eternity. I'm convinced of that now. What do you mean? Asked Jack carefully. Well, when I first woke up here, after I gave up screaming, I began beckoning passers-by and the worshippers for help. At first, I believed they were ignoring me. I wouldn't blame them. Then, after many, many days and nights, I came to the conclusion that they were blind to me. Jack looked puzzled. You mean invisible? But that's impossible. I can see you perfectly. Well, you are a rare exception. What, so you are saying that I'm the only one in the world who can see you? No, there have been others. Only as many as I can count on both hands. She turned her eyes down to her now outstretched fingertips. Jack slowly followed her gaze and noticed that her fingernails were perfectly trimmed but unpolished. Their eyes met again. Jack felt a dreamlike sense of unreality as he sat there in the cold with this most unlikely of companions. A moment of silence passed. Then the loud revving of a bus engine on the high street snapped him out of his stupor. So what you are saying is you died? You're saying you're a ghost? Her gaze left his for the first time in what seemed like a minute. She let out a long sigh. An example, she replied. And yes, although I can't say for sure. Jack stared at her in disbelief. What's your name? He asked softly. Helen? Helen Sarah Burnham. How did you... What happened to you? The two strangers stared at each other across the cold gravestones, across time, across centuries of cold decay. This was the first time in their conversation, Jack thought, that she looked troubled. I don't know. I can't claim to know the mind of God. Her eyes dropped now, staring at the cold, wet leaves that clung to the earth. She continued quietly. I tried, I really did. But the leching and the depravity bore their way through the roots of your better nature sooner or later. Her arm shot out suddenly. A pale, cold but strong limb, he followed the direction of her pointed finger. It was there, our lodgings. She seemed to be pointing at a place in the middle distance between a red brick building and a derelict pub, but not exactly at either place. Where? Jack asked patiently. It sat there, our lodgings. A cesspit. But it was that or the frost taking your digits one by one. I saw women, better women, leave the warmth of the fire and collapse onto the street, but I stayed. Most of us stayed because we were young and scared. She paused and gazed off into nowhere. Her eyes softened. There were these two bairns. Sweet little angels, Tabitha and Alexandra. Their ma left them behind one night and disappeared into the rain. He screamed the house down. He picked us up and shook us up together. I think he expected some conspiracy.
Why did she run?
Jack whispered. She met his gaze. He detected anger buried deep in her eyes and kept in check. We all had good reason to run. We all met the devil in him, though we seldom spoke about it. We didn't have to.
What happened then?
After he interrogated us, he flew out the door after her. I knew if he found her, he would end her, or worse. He wasn't going to lose an income, and he certainly wasn't going to be saddled with 2 young pups. They might suffer a worse fate whether he found her or not. I knew I had to act. Once he was far enough down the lane, I grabbed Tabby out of her basket and I ran. She was only 10 months old, and I'd seen her raised from... Her vacant eyes began to flood with ethereal tears. She fought them back, blinked, and they were replaced with anger once more. It was cold. The rain had come on strong to melt the frost. We made it to the Withington milestone and hid in the old bottle shed at the back. Jack knew of it anyway. It was a long derelict pub named after the old stone marker opposite that proclaimed the distance to both Wilmslow and Manchester. The marker, now covered by an overgrown hedge outside the fire station, was a forgotten relic of simpler times. Not forgotten by all. Her eyes began to well again. I tried to make her happy. I tried all the tricks, but she was just so cold. She wouldn't be quiet. Then I could hear him. He was screaming. Him and 2 more heathen bastard stinking animals. Jack began to feel an icy chill seep into his skin, but not from his head or exposed neck. It seemed impossibly to be seeping into his feet. He suppressed a shiver as she continued. I put my hand over her mouth. I just wanted her to be quiet. I begged her to be quiet. I smothered the pain. She stared daggers into Jack's wide eyes. His shock at the revelation turned almost immediately to fear as icy cold tendrils wound their way like thick vines around his legs. He looked down in shock, but could see nothing. He reflexively inhaled loudly, and almost immediately, the frost that had wound its way to his bones began to dissipate. He met her eyes again, shaking now with fear. Her rage had faded to a melancholic stare. Did you feel it? She asked calmly after a moment. Feel what? Jack stuttered in fear. The void. Jack could only stare dumbly at her, every nerve on edge. He felt an almost uncontrollable urge to run. Just get up and run, he told himself, but his legs would not obey him. Although void isn't quite the right phrase. Void of light and warmth, to be sure, but full of fantastic tortures, which your soul won't endure. She raised a pale hand from her lap and pointed down towards her death seat in what appeared to be a well-practiced gesture. She gently spread her legs and, reaching low with her other hand, pulled up the main fabric of her dress, revealing mud-stained tights and petticoats beneath. Using her free hand, she gently brushed aside the fine layers of material, revealing the carefully chiseled engraving on the stone. He tilted his trembling head to read the epitaph. It read, "Here lies the infant Tabitha, taken in the year of our Lord, 1888, only sleeping." Helen let her petticoats drop gently to the stone and caressed them subtly. She looked up at her guest once more. "Can you hear her weep?" she asked. Fear finally broke Jack's paralysis. He stood up and bolted from the graveside. His legs carried him clumsily and almost unconsciously across the wet grass. He was nearly at the central path that led out onto the high street, back into the warmth of the rational, and although his neck muscles resisted, He had to look back. She sat there in a pool of icy white mist, her eyes locked onto his. She screamed at him. Her voice echoed around the gravestones and rose high onto the church walls. This only quickened his flight. After what seemed like an eternity, his feet connected with the wet stone path. The entrance to the graveyard wasn't far. Jack slipped wildly on the flagstone, nearly losing his balance altogether. He regained his footing and came to a halt. A cold sweat now clung to his whole body. Just then, his panic was broken by a dry snapping sound above. A magpie had taken hasty flight from the towering tree above and shaken hard 2 protruding branches. He looked up and raised his hands defensively. A lone sycamore leaf glided down from the high bough that sheltered the entrance of the cemetery. It landed gracefully at his feet. It was brown with age and impossibly dry. His usual impulse would have been to crush it into the dirt and savor the satisfying sound as its rotten arteries and fibers disintegrated under the weight of his boot. Not now, however, as he now knew that what seemed like the peaceful dying of the light may signal the beginning of the soul's endless torment.